On a cold, bright spring morning at Highgrove, as the first real warmth of the year moved slowly across the frost-silvered grass of the walled garden, Prince Louis was led down a gravel path toward a gathering that would have surprised almost anyone who believed a child had no useful place among working beekeepers. The morning's purpose had been written, the previous week, on a single sheet of paper that circulated among a small group of estate staff. To anyone who read it carefully, the sheet contained two ideas that did not usually sit comfortably together on the same page. The first was the protection of something rare and very old. The second was the willingness, if it came to that, to change that rare and very old thing in order to keep it alive at all. Anyone familiar with how the estate had cared for its bees across the years would have understood that these two ideas, placed side by side, described not an ordinary spring task but a quiet reckoning. Prince Louis did not know the full weight of the sheet of paper. He knew only that he had been told he could come, that he had been told he must be calm, and that he had been told the bees would tell him a great deal if he was willing to be still long enough to let them. The decision to include him had not been casual. It would have been simpler, and in some ways safer, to keep a young boy at a polite distance from a morning that the adults present already suspected might be difficult. Instead, he had been brought directly to the heart of it, walking between the clipped hedges in a borrowed veil that was slightly too large for him, holding the hand of the head gardener until the path opened out and the apiary came into view. The orchard beyond the walled garden held that particular early spring stillness that is not really stillness at all, but a kind of waiting. The fruit trees were not yet in blossom. The grass was wet. The light was thin and clean and without much heat in it. And at the far edge of the orchard, arranged in a loose and unhurried line, stood the hives. Those who had assembled there understood the seriousness of the morning, even if the youngest among them did not yet. Highgrove does not merely provide a setting for the people who work in it. It provides a standard. Every careful thing done within its gardens carries the quiet memory of careful things done there before, and every choice made now carries the obligation of being worthy of the choices that will be made there long after everyone presently standing in the orchard has gone. The keepers appeared aware of this as they waited, their voices low, their movements unhurried, their attention already turned toward the hives. The morning had begun the way mornings at Highgrove tend to begin, without ceremony and without noise. But by the time the first hive was approached, and the first soft column of smoke rose into the cold air, and the first frame was lifted slowly into the light, the stillness had taken on the particular quality of a place holding its breath. What followed over the next several hours would not simply be a spring health check. It would be a reckoning with what it means to keep something rare alive in a world that has very nearly decided it can do without it. Part 2, Context and Background. To understand why this morning mattered, it is necessary to understand what was actually living inside those hives. The bees kept at Highgrove are not the bees most people picture when they picture a bee. They are darker. They are smaller in their movements, steadier in cold weather, and far older as a lineage than almost anyone who keeps them. They are the native dark honey bee of Britain and Northern Europe, the bee that lived in these islands long before anyone thought to write anything down about it. The bee that survived the long gray winters of this country not because it was managed cleverly, but because, across uncounted generations, the ones that could not survive those winters simply did not. For a very long time, that was the only kind of honey bee in Britain. And then, slowly and then quickly, it almost stopped being any kind of bee in Britain at all. Disease arrived. Imported queens of brighter, gentler, faster-building strains arrived with them, brought in by keepers who wanted more honey and calmer hives and could not be blamed for wanting them. The native dark bee was crossed and crossed again, until, across most of the country, it existed only as a faint inheritance buried inside other bees, no longer a line you could point to, but only a memory you could occasionally still see in a darker wing or a steadier temper. Highgrove was one of the small number of places where someone had refused to let that happen. The estate had kept a population of the native dark bee deliberately, patiently, and at some cost, treating it not as a source of honey but as a living inheritance, the way one might keep an old apple variety alive, not because it crops well, but because if no one keeps it, it is gone, and once it is gone, it does not come back. The apiary was modest in size. It produced little honey of consequence. Its purpose was never volume. Its purpose was continuity. That purpose was now under quiet strain. For 3 seasons, the colonies had been weakening. The signs were not dramatic, and that was part of what made them frightening. The bees were not dying in heaps in the grass. They were simply diminishing. Colonies that should have come through the winter strong came through it thin. Queens that should have laid steadily laid patchily. The dark bee's famous resilience, the very thing that had justified keeping it, seemed each year to have a little less of itself to spend. The keepers had several explanations, and none of them was complete. The population at Highgrove had become small, and a small population is a fragile one, because it carries less variety within it and has less to draw on when something goes wrong. Years of careful protection from outside bees had kept the line pure, but had also kept it narrow. The very wall built to protect the inheritance had perhaps begun to starve it. And so the morning's health check was not the routine spring inspection it would have been in any ordinary year. It was the morning on which the people responsible for this small surviving line of an ancient bee would have to look honestly at what they had and decide whether protecting its purity any longer was the same thing as protecting it at all, or whether it had quietly become the opposite. The boy in the oversized veil did not know any of this in those terms, but he had been told, on the walk down, that the bees were not well, and that the grown-ups did not agree about why, and that he should listen more than he spoke. He had nodded very seriously at that, in the way children nod when they have understood that something matters even before they have understood what it is. Part 3, the CHARACTRS entered. The people who had gathered at the apiary that morning had not been chosen because they would agree. Margaret Ainsley arrived first, as she almost always did. She had kept bees on the estate for the better part of 3 decades and the native dark bee for nearly all of that time, and she carried the line's history, the way some people carry an old grief, quietly, completely, and without any need to explain it to anyone. She moved among the hives without hurry and without fear, her hands knowing the work so thoroughly that they no longer seemed to be thinking about it. She had spent the longer part of her life defending this particular bee against the slow tide that had taken it nearly everywhere else, and she had not defended it by being flexible. She had defended it by being immovable. She arrived carrying her own smoker, lit before she left the shed, and the particular settled attentiveness of a person who already suspected what this morning was going to ask of her, and had not yet decided how much of it she was willing to give. Daniel Voss arrived a few minutes later, and his arrival changed the temperature of the small group in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He was young, by the standards of the people already there. He worked with bee disease and bee genetics for a living, and he spoke about colonies in the language of samples and sequences and survival rates, a language that some of the older keepers heard as cold and some heard as simply foreign. He was not from the estate. He had been brought in, and the fact of having been brought in sat on him visibly, as it tends to sit on anyone who is asked to walk into a place that loves something and suggest, however gently, that loving it has not been enough. He carried a hard plastic case and a quiet wariness, and he greeted Margaret with a politeness so careful that it was, in itself, a kind of admission that he knew exactly how he was likely to be received. Thomas Reed came next, and almost no one watching would have given his arrival a second thought. He was an apprentice, young, unhurried, the sort of person whose entire role in a morning like this appears at first to be the carrying of things. He carried things now. Specifically, he carried, with both hands and a care that did not yet make sense to anyone, an old domed shape of woven straw, dark with age, the kind of beehive that has not been in ordinary use in this country for the better part of a century. He set it down at the edge of the orchard, slightly apart from the modern hives, and then he stepped back from it and said nothing, which was, it would later turn out, the most important thing anyone did all morning. Mr. Pello, the head gardener, arrived last, walking the boy down by the hand. Pello had been at Highgrove longer than almost anyone and held its memory the way the oldest tree in a garden holds the shape of every wind that has ever pushed against it. He did not keep the bees himself, but he had watched the bees be kept for a very long time, and he had the particular usefulness of a person who remembers not only what was done, but why it was done, and what it had been like before it was done at all. He brought the boy to the edge of the group, settled him on an upturned crate where he could see, rested a hand briefly on his shoulder, and then let him be. Prince Louis sat where he had been put, smaller than everyone, veiled and serious, and watched. For a while the adults spoke to one another and not to him, in the low, overlapping way of people who know each other's work. And then there was one of those small, natural silences that fall into any gathering, and into that silence the boy asked a question. He did not ask it cleverly. He asked it the way children ask things, which is to say directly, without first checking whether it was a good question to ask. He asked why, if the bees had lived here longer than anyone, they could not just be left alone the way they had always been left alone before there were any people to look after them at all. It was not a sophisticated question, but it landed in the orchard with a precision that none of the adults had managed all morning, because it was, underneath its plainness, exactly the question the entire morning was about, and the adults all heard that at the same time, and for a moment none of them answered it. Part 4, the tension, purity versus survival. The boy's question hung in the cold air, and as it hung there, the real shape of the morning's disagreement became visible. For Margaret Ainsley, the answer to the boy's question was rooted in everything she had spent her life protecting. The bee had survived being left alone for thousands of years, she said, because for those thousands of years it had been allowed to be exactly what it was. Every winter that killed the weak ones had made the line stronger. Every century without interference had made it more completely itself. The reason it was endangered now was not that it had been left alone. It was that it had not been left alone, that brighter, easier, imported bees had been brought in everywhere else, and the native line had been crossed and diluted until it had nearly drowned in other bees' blood. The thing that had nearly killed this bee, she said, was precisely the willingness to change it, to respond to the present crisis by crossing it with something hardier, to dilute it in order to save it, was not saving it. It was finishing, with our own hands and our good intentions, the thing the last century had only begun. A bee that is no longer the native bee is not a rescued native bee. It is the absence of one, wearing its color. She did not say this loudly. She said it the way people say things they have already decided they would rather lose than betray. For Daniel Voss, the answer to the same question was rooted in what he had measured rather than what he had inherited. He did not disagree with the history. He agreed with all of it, which was part of what made what he had to say so difficult to dismiss. The problem, he said, was that being right about the past did not keep a colony alive through next winter. The Highgrove line had been protected so completely, and for so long that it had become very small, and a very small population, however pure, carries very little variety inside it, and a population with very little variety inside it has very little to reach for when disease arrives or a hard season comes. The wall that had kept the line pure had also slowly kept it narrow, and a thing kept narrow long enough does not stay strong. To refuse all change on principle, he said carefully, was a defensible position right up until the moment it became the reason there was nothing left to defend. The purest possible line, he said, is of no use to anyone if its purity is the thing that lets it die. The collision between the two of them was not hostile. Both were too experienced and too serious for hostility, but it was real, and it was substantial, and it was precisely the disagreement that the morning had been arranged. whether anyone had said so aloud in order to have. Mr. Pello listened the way old gardeners listen, which is to say without interrupting and without any visible hurry to take a side, because he had lived long enough to have seen both kinds of mistake made, and to know that each of them is made by people who are sure they are right. Thomas Reed listened with an attentiveness that, in hindsight, was noticeably greater than an apprentice's part in the conversation required, and he glanced more than once toward the old straw shape he had carried in and set apart from the others. The boy listened hardest of all, in the total, unself-conscious way that children listen when adults have forgotten they are there. Prince Louis said nothing during this part of the morning. He had been told to listen, and he listened, and his stillness, which an onlooker might have read simply as a child being well-behaved, was in fact the stillness of someone taking something in completely. The tension reached its most concentrated point when Margaret stopped speaking, walked to the second hive in the line, lifted the lid, drew out a single frame, and held it up into the thin light without a word. She did not need to say anything. The frame said it for her. There were too few bees on it. The pattern of the brood was broken, scattered, gapped where it should have been solid. It was the frame of a colony that was not collapsing dramatically but was quietly, patiently running out of itself. She did not present it as an argument. She presented it as the thing the argument was about. This, her silence said, is what we actually have. Whatever we decide about this. Daniel Voss looked at the frame for a long moment. Then he looked at the boy on the crate. Then he reached down and opened the hard plastic case at his feet. Part 5, the misdirection. What Daniel Voss took out of the case was not a queen of some hardier strain. It was not a proposal to crossbreed. It was a folder, and inside the folder were results. For the better part of the previous year, without making a great deal of noise about it, he had been quietly testing the genetics of every colony on the estate and where he could get them, of the few other surviving pockets of the native dark bee elsewhere in the country. He had not done this in order to recommend replacing the Highgrove line. He had done it in order to understand, precisely and not sentimentally, exactly how pure what remained actually was, and where within it the purest part still lived. The results were not what anyone in the orchard had been bracing for. The estate's main colonies, the ones in the modern hives that everyone had been tending and watching and worrying over, were not the purest line. Years of careful management had kept them protected, but management is not the same as wildness, and somewhere along the decades, a faint thread of other blood had entered even them. They were the native bee, very largely. But they were not, by the strict measure Voss had applied, the truest surviving expression of it. The truest surviving expression of it was in the old straw skep that Thomas Reed had carried in that morning and set apart from the others without a word. The apprentice, it emerged as Voss spoke and the others slowly understood, had for several years been quietly keeping a single colony in the old way, in the old woven hive, in a sheltered corner of the estate that no one paid much attention to, with almost no intervention at all. He had not done it as a project. He had not announced it. He had done it because an old keeper, long retired, had once told him that the oldest corner of the estate had always held bees, and that it would be a pity to let it stop. And Thomas, being the kind of person who takes that sort of thing seriously, had simply quietly kept it from stopping. He had not crossed it with anything. He had not fed it richly or managed it cleverly. He had largely left it alone, in exactly the way the boy had innocently asked whether the bees could be left alone. And being left alone, in that one forgotten corner, was precisely what had kept it the truest of all. The misdirection of the morning collapsed in the space of a few minutes in a single straw hive. The story everyone had walked into the orchard expecting to argue, the story in which purity and survival were enemies, and one of them would have to be sacrificed to save the other, turned out not to be the true story at all. Purity and survival had not been opponents. They had been the same thing all along, growing quietly in a corner no one had been looking at. kept alive not by the wall of careful management, and not by the intervention of new blood, but by patient, unglamorous, almost invisible tending that had asked for no credit and received none. Margaret Ainsley was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she did not concede the argument, because the argument as it had been framed had ceased to exist. She did something more telling. She walked over to the old skep, crouched beside it, listened to it the way only someone who has spent 30 years listening to bees can listen to one, and then she asked Thomas a question. It was a technical question, precise and detailed, the kind of question one keeper asks another when they have stopped defending a position and started trying to understand one. And in asking it, she signaled to everyone who knew her well enough to hear it that she had moved from the thing she had come prepared to do, which was to refuse, to the thing she had not expected to do, which was to learn. The distinction mattered enormously. Refusal protects what you already believe. The question she asked was an act of someone willing to find out she had been protecting the right thing in the wrong place. Mr. Pello, who had said almost nothing all morning, allowed himself a single small expression of something that was not quite surprise, because he had been at Highgrove long enough to half expect that the most important thing in any garden is usually the thing growing in the corner no one weeds. And the boy on the crate, who had asked the question that turned out to be the right one, watched the old straw hive with the complete and serious attention of a child who has understood that something he said had mattered, even if he did not yet entirely understand how. Part 6, the vision statement. It was at this point, when the adults had fallen into the particular silence of people rearranging what they thought they knew, that Prince Louis spoke again. He did not speak cleverly. He spoke the way he had asked his first question, plainly and without performance, in the small, clear voice of a child saying the obvious thing that the grown-ups have talked themselves too far around to see. He said that it sounded as though the bees had been all right the whole time in the corner, when nobody was bothering them, and that the part that had gone wrong was the part where people were trying hardest to help. And then, because he was a child and children do not know which thoughts they are supposed to keep to themselves, he asked whether that meant the way to look after the bees was just to do for all of them what Thomas had quietly been doing for the ones in the straw hive. It was, once again, not a sophisticated thing to say, but it cut directly to the center of what the morning had become, and the adults heard it land, and this time someone answered him. Margaret answered him, and in answering the boy she was also, everyone present understood, answering the year and the disagreement in herself. She said that the boy had seen the thing the rest of them had spent a great deal of expertise managing not to see. The question, she said, had never really been whether to keep the bee pure or to keep it alive. That had been a false choice, and it had been a false choice that had quietly cost them 3 bad seasons, because it had set the people who loved the bee most against the people who understood it best, when those should never have been 2 different camps at all. The truest line had not survived because it was protected hardest. It had survived because it had been tended honestly, in conditions close to the ones that had made it in the first place, by someone who had asked it for nothing and given it room. The purity she had spent her life defending, and the survival Voss had spent his year measuring, were not in opposition. They had simply both been waiting, the entire time, in a corner, for someone to stop arguing long enough to notice. The way forward, she said, was not to choose between the wall and the new blood. It was to take the truest surviving line, the one in the old straw hive, and to widen it patiently and carefully from within its own kind, using the small surviving pockets elsewhere that Voss's work had located, so that the line could be made larger and stronger without ever being made into something else. Purity would not be sacrificed to survival. Survival would be built, slowly, out of purity, by treating the bee less as something to be guarded behind a wall and more as something to be genuinely understood, and given the conditions it had always quietly asked for. Voss's work was the second half of what she described, and she said so plainly, with the particular generosity of a person who has just discovered that the people she had been resisting were on her side after all. His measurements had told them where the truth still lived and which other pockets of it survived to widen it with. His science had not arrived to replace the inheritance. It had arrived to find it accurately in time. And then she said the thing that the whole morning had, without anyone planning it, been moving toward. She said that the corner Thomas had been keeping, the unwatched, unweeded, almost forgotten corner, had turned out to be the most important place on the estate, and that this was not an accident but a lesson, and that the lesson was that the things most worth keeping are very rarely kept by the loud and deliberate effort of guarding them, and very often kept by the quiet, unrewarded, almost invisible work of someone simply not letting them stop. Heritage, she said, is not preserved by refusing to let anything change around it. It is preserved by being genuinely understood and genuinely tended by people willing to do the unglamorous part where nobody is watching. The orchard received this in a silence that was not empty but full, the silence of people who have arrived together, by a route none of them would have chosen, at something true. The boy on the crate did not entirely follow all of it, but he understood that the morning had turned, and that a thing he had said had helped turn it, and he sat very straight on his upturned crate with the particular pride of a child who has been quietly, genuinely useful among adults. Part 7. Broader Impact and Legacy. What was decided that morning in a cold orchard, around an old straw hive that almost no one had been paying attention to, did not stay in that orchard. The native dark bee is not endangered only at Highgrove. It is faint and scattered across the whole of Britain and much of northern Europe, surviving in exactly the way it survived here, in small protected pockets kept going by a handful of people who refused to let them stop. For years those pockets had largely worked alone, and many of them had made, in good faith, the same quiet error the estate had nearly made, guarding a line so closely that the guarding itself slowly weakened it. The approach that took shape in the orchard, finding the truest surviving line precisely, then widening it patiently from within its own kind by connecting the scattered pockets to one another rather than diluting any of them, was not a method that belonged only to one estate. It was, in principle, a method any of those keepers could use, and the estate's apiary, small and quiet as it was, became a place others began to learn it from. The implications reached further than bees, though bees were enough. The lesson that ran underneath the morning, that the things most worth keeping are usually kept not by the dramatic act of defending them, but by the patient, unrewarded, almost unnoticed work of tending them honestly, is not a lesson that applies only to an ancient insect in a Gloucestershire orchard. It applies to old apple varieties and old languages and old crafts, and a great many other inheritances that survive. When they survive at all, in the corner no one weeds, kept going by someone like the apprentice who carried the straw hive in and set it down and said nothing. The boy who asked the question that turned the morning did not understand its full reach and would not for some years, but he had been brought to the apiary rather than kept away from it for a reason, and the reason had quietly justified itself. He had asked the plain thing the experts had talked their way past. He had been listened to, and what he had said had helped a small, ancient, nearly lost line of bees be saved without being turned into something it was not. A single old skep in a forgotten corner of one estate had turned out to hold the truest surviving thread of a bee older than almost anything around it, kept alive not by a wall and not by cleverness but by quiet attention. And from that corner, patiently, the thread began to be drawn outward again, into more hives, more estates, more hands, until the thing that had very nearly been let slip away was, slowly and without drama, given back its future. It had not been preserved by being guarded. It had been saved by being understood. And the difference between those two things, demonstrated in a cold orchard on a bright spring morning, was the whole of what the morning had been for.